Hey everyone, Sarah here. Rewind Justice brings you revenge stories that will blow your mind. If you're ready, hit subscribe and let's go.
There is a garden behind the house on Renfield Lane in Asheville, North Carolina that my mother tended for 31 years. She started it the spring she and my father moved in. He helped her build the raised beds that first year. Cedar planks. He cut them himself. After he died, she kept building. She added a third bed. Then a fourth. Tomatoes in summer, lavender along the fence, dahlias by the back gate that she called her ridiculous indulgence. He was right. They were spectacular. I know every inch of that garden because for the last 3 years of her life, I was the one in it. My sister Renee was not. That's not an accusation. It's just true. Renee lives in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a 4-bedroom house with her husband Marcus and their 2 daughters, and she visited Asheville exactly 4 times in the last 3 years of our mother's life. Thanksgiving 2021 when she left on the 27th. Christmas 2022 when she arrived on the 23rd and was back in Arizona by the 26th. My mother's 67th birthday in April of 2023, when Renee surprised her with a flower arrangement and a spa gift card that Mom couldn't use because she'd started having trouble walking by then. And the last time, November of 2023, 3 weeks before the end. I was not counting those visits to build a case. I was counting them because I was the one watching my mother's face when a visit ended. When the car reversed out of the driveway and turned onto Renfield Lane, heading for the highway, heading for the airport, heading back to a life that had room for us in small doses and holidays, I watched my mother's expression go neutral and still. The way it does when you've learned not to hope for something you're not going to get. She never complained about Renee. Not once. Not directly. She'd say things like, "Renee has a lot on her plate." Or, "Arizona is so far." She'd say it in this particular way. Quiet, conclusory, that meant the subject was closed, that she'd made her peace with it, that she'd decided loving someone from a distance was still loving them. I respected that. I also knew it wasn't the whole truth. My name is Callie Marsh. I'm 31 years old. I'm a licensed structural engineer at Beacon Plus Ward Design Group in Asheville, where I've worked for the past 6 years. I make a decent living. Not a spectacular one. The spectacular ones at my firm are the principals, and I'm not a principal yet. But decent. Enough to have my own apartment. Enough to have choices. 3 years ago I chose to spend most of them at 44 Renfield Lane. Mom was diagnosed with progressive supranuclear palsy in January of 2021. It's a neurological condition. It affects balance, speech, swallowing, vision. It moves slowly at first and then it doesn't. Her neurologist at Mission Hospital, Dr. Anita Vora, was direct with her from the beginning. There would be a window of years where she could manage with some help. After that she would need more. And after that, she said it gently but she said it, she would need everything. Mom told me on the phone. I drove to Renfield Lane that afternoon and didn't leave for 3 days. We sat in the kitchen for most of it. We drank her particular coffee, hazelnut, too sweet, and we talked about everything except what we were really talking about. The garden. Her friends from the ceramic studio on Lexington Avenue. A novel she'd been meaning to finish. Dad occasionally. The years. I moved my most necessary things to the guest room 8 months later. I kept my apartment in the South Slope neighborhood, subletting it to a graduate student at UNC Asheville, which covered the rent, and I spent 4 nights a week at Renfield Lane. Then 5. Then in the last year all 7. Mom and I had a system. I handled the logistics. The appointments at Mission Hospital, the occupational therapy visits twice a week, the modifications we needed to make to the house, the grab bars in the bathroom, the ramp over the back porch step, the removal of the throw rugs she'd loved and that were now a liability. I handled the yard. I handled the garden. I handled the bills and the insurance appeals and the phone calls to the Social Security office that always lasted 45 minutes longer than they should. She handled the conversation. That's how I'd put it if I had to put it into words. She talked. I listened. 3 years worth of listening. She told me about her own mother who had died when Renee and I were small and who she'd never fully grieved, she thought. She told me about the early years with Dad, not the cleaned-up version, the actual version, the one with the arguments and the reconciliations and the specific moment she decided he was the person she was going to build a life with. She told me about Renee as a child, before the distance, before Scottsdale, when they'd been close in a way that had simply, quietly stopped being possible. He told me about the house. Not in dramatic terms. Just practically the way Mom talked about most things. She told me that she and Dad had purchased 44 Renfield Lane in 1989 for $147,000, which had seemed like an enormous amount of money then. She told me it had been appraised the previous year at $618,000, which had seemed to her like a hallucination. She told me she'd spoken with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Holt at Holt and Deering Estate Law on Marymount Avenue, about what she wanted to happen to it. She didn't tell me what she'd decided. I didn't ask. It wasn't my business to ask. I found out later. I found out the way you find out about most things in this story. Not when you expected to and not in the way you'd imagined. Renee arrived the night before the funeral. I picked her up from Asheville Regional Airport. It was February, a cold one even by Asheville standards, and the drive down 240 was quiet in the particular way that it gets when two people have a lot to say and neither of them is ready to start. Renee looked tired. She'd flown in from Phoenix on a connecting flight through Atlanta. She had Marcus's large rolling suitcase, which struck me as odd. For a funeral. But I didn't say anything. We stayed at the house together that night. Two sisters in their childhood bedrooms, in a house that still smelled like hazelnut coffee, with a garden outside the back window that was dormant for winter but still, I knew, alive underneath. The funeral was at Riverside Memorial Chapel on Elk Mountain Scenic Highway. Mom had been specific about that. Small, she'd said. Just family and the people who actually knew her. It was about 40 people. Her friends from the ceramic studio were there. A small group of women in their 60s and 70s who had been meeting every Thursday for 15 years, who had known her before she got sick and after, who had shown up every week right to the end with herbal tea and good conversation and the particular irreplaceable grace of people who don't require you to be okay when you're not. Her neighbor from across the street, Dawn Pruitt, who'd brought her mail in for 2 years and who cried more than I expected. Dr. Vora, who wasn't required to come and came anyway. I gave the eulogy. I'd written it at 2 a.m. the night before on the back of a receipt. I talked about the coffee, the garden, the dahlias she called her ridiculous indulgence. I talked about what it meant to stay and I tried to say it without making it about anything other than what it was. About her, about the specific shape of her life, about the way she'd built something real on Renfield Lane over 31 years and tended it with the same patient, consistent attention that she brought to everything she loved. Renee sat in the front row. She didn't make eye contact during the eulogy. Afterward, in the parking lot, her friend Shelby, who'd flown in from Scottsdale for the service, which I appreciated, told me it was a beautiful eulogy. Renee said, She was looking at her phone. I told myself she was grieving. I told myself people grieve differently. I believe both of those things are true. I just also believe that what happened the next morning was not grief. I came back to the house the following day around 10. I'd stayed at my own apartment the previous night. The graduate student had moved out at the end of January, the timing unfortunate but what it was, and I'd slept a full night for the first time and I couldn't remember how long. Something releases after the funeral. The sustained, impossible effort of the preceding months lifts, briefly like pressure equalizing. I'd slept 9 hours. I'd made coffee in my own kitchen. I'd stood at my apartment window looking at the South Slope neighborhood and felt something I couldn't quite name. I drove to Renfield Lane. I had things to collect. Clothes mostly. Some of my structural drafting books that I'd brought over at some point and never taken back. Mom's winter tomato seedlings in the kitchen window that needed attention before the cold killed them. My key didn't work. I stood on the front porch and turned it twice, the way you do when a key doesn't work, as though the second attempt will achieve a different result. It didn't. The deadbolt had been replaced. I could see it, new hardware, brushed nickel, still bright. I rang the bell. Renee answered in jeans and a sweatshirt. She looked like she'd been up for hours. I changed the locks, she said. Not by way of apology. Just as a statement of fact. I said, I can see that. She said, Mom's gone. There's no reason for you to be coming and going. She stepped back from the door. She didn't invite me in. I'm going through everything this week while I'm here. If there's anything of yours, I'll put it in a box. I said, Renee. It's not personal, she said. And I heard an echo of something, although I couldn't place it then. I'm just being practical. Marcus and I have been talking about the market. Asheville property values are. She moved her hand, a gesture that meant you know. It makes sense to think about next steps. I asked her what next steps meant. She said, the house has to go through the estate. But Patricia Holt already told me Mom left clear instructions. So, another hand gesture. It should be straightforward. She closed the door. I stood on the porch for a moment. The cedar planks of the front steps, Dad had replaced them in 2003, were still solid under my feet. I looked at the winter bear sycamore in the front yard, the one Mom used to say was too big and too beautiful to cut down, and I thought about calling Patricia Holt. I decided not to. Not yet. Here is what I knew and Renee did not. 14 months earlier, December of 2022, Mom had called me into the small study at the back of the house. The one with the bookshelves that went to the ceiling and the window that looked over the garden. She was seated behind the desk she'd inherited from her own mother, and she had an expression I recognized. The one that meant she'd already decided something and was now informing me. She told me she'd been thinking about the house. She said that she'd seen what can happen when a property goes through the standard probate process with multiple heirs who have different opinions about what should happen to it. She'd seen it with a friend of hers, her friend Louise, whose mother's house had taken 2 years and $40,000 in legal fees to resolve, while Louise and her brother stopped speaking entirely. Mom said she didn't want that. She said she'd thought carefully about it. She said she wanted to transfer the property to me directly. She'd already spoken with Patricia Holt. The mechanism was straightforward. A transfer on death deed filed with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds. It would take effect automatically upon her death. No probate. The house would come directly to me. She said she knew it wasn't equal. She looked at me when she said it. Levelly, the way she looked at you when she needed you to hear the whole sentence. She said Renee's financial situation was different from mine. That Marcus's commercial real estate business had faced difficulties in the past 2 years. That she'd thought about this for a long time. She said, Renee will receive the investment accounts. That's roughly $214,000. The house, she looked at the study around her, at the bookshelves, the window, the garden beyond it. The house is yours. That's what I want. She slid a copy of the transfer on death deed across the desk. I sat with it for a long time. I said, Mom, this isn't, you don't have to. She said, I know I don't have to. I said, Renee is going to. Renee, she said, is going to receive $214,000 and the contents of the house to divide as she sees fit. Her voice was entirely calm. What I have decided about the property is my decision to make. Patricia has the original documents. This is your copy. I folded it. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. I didn't know what to say, so I went to the window and looked at the garden for a while. The dahlias were done for the season by then. The raised cedar beds, the ones Dad had built in 1989 and that I'd been repairing in sections ever since, were bare. I said, I'll take care of it. She said, I know you will. I let 3 weeks go by. I wanted to be honest about why. Part of it was grief, real, total, disorienting grief that made the days formless and the simplest decisions feel impossible. Part of it was the genuine desire to give Renee space, to not make the first weeks after Mom's death into a conflict, to believe that maybe she would call Patricia Holt herself and find out and we would be able to have that conversation before it became something harder. Part of it, I'll admit, was something quieter and less charitable. I was curious what Renee was going to do. I wanted to know what she thought she knew. I wanted to see, at least once, what it looked like when someone moves through the world in complete confidence that they understand a situation they have never actually been present for. I found out on a Thursday in early March. My phone rang at 11:14 in the morning. I was at my desk at Beacon Plus Ward, reviewing load calculations for a mixed-use project on Clingman Avenue, when I saw the number, 828 area code, unfamiliar. I answered. A woman's voice said, Is this Callie Marsh? I said yes. This is Sandra Whitfield. I'm a representative at Blue Ridge Title and Escrow on Tunnel Road in Asheville. I'm calling regarding the property at 44 Renfield Lane. I'm calling because we've received a listing agreement for the property, and when we ran the title search this morning, another pause, this one slightly longer. There are documents on file with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds that I think you should be aware of. I said, I know about them. Sandra Whitfield said, I see. A beat of silence. I could hear her deciding something on the other end of the line. Then I think we need to have a conversation before this listing proceeds any further. Would you be able to come in today? I said, What time is the open house scheduled? Saturday, she said. 11 a.m. I said, I'll come in today. And I'd like Patricia Holt to be there when we have this conversation. Another pause. Of course, she said. I think that's a good idea. I called Patricia Holt next. I'd met her twice before. Once when Mom had first told me about the transfer on death deed, and once in January when she'd wanted to go through the filing confirmations together. Patricia Holt was in her mid-50s with short silver hair and reading glasses she took on and off with the precise economy of someone who has been doing it for decades. She ran Holt and Deering Estate Law out of a converted Victorian on Marymount Avenue that had been her office since 2001. When I called, her assistant, a young man named Theo, put me through immediately. She picked up on the second ring. I said, Patricia. It's Callie Marsh. My sister has listed the house. There was a pause. Then she said, I was wondering when you'd call. Her tone was not surprised. It was, if anything, the tone of someone who had been waiting for something predictable to reach its predictable conclusion. I received a message from her yesterday asking me to confirm the terms of the estate. I haven't called her back yet. I said, she doesn't know about the transfer on death deed. No, Patricia said. She doesn't. I'm not able to disclose your mother's estate documents to Renee until the formal reading. But I can absolutely be present when the title company has their conversation with her. She paused. Would you like to be present for that conversation as well? I thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Yes, I said. I did not call Renee. I want to be clear about that. I had the option. I could have picked up the phone and said, Renee, there's something you need to know before Saturday. I could have done it kindly, privately, with the conversation happening between the two of us instead of in a title company office on Tunnel Road. I chose not to, and I've thought about that choice since. Here's where I've landed. What Renee did the morning after the funeral was not a mistake. It wasn't a miscommunication. It was a decision. He changed the locks. She hired a realtor. She signed a listing agreement on a property she had spent 4 days in over the past 3 years, without asking me a single question about the estate documents, without calling Patricia Holt, without doing anything except operating from the assumption that she already knew how the story ended. That's not grief. That's not practicality either, despite what she said. That's a way of looking at another person and deciding that their presence doesn't require accounting for. I'd been accounted for as negligible my entire life in certain ways by certain people. The sister who'd stayed. The one who didn't have the bigger life to get back to. The one who would be fine, who would manage, who didn't need to be consulted because she'd be around anyway. I'd made my peace with that mostly. What I hadn't made peace with was the idea that the home my mother had built for 31 years, the home I had kept for 3, was going to be decided without me being in the room. So I was going to be in the room. Saturday came. I arrived at 44 Renfield Lane at 9:47 a.m. The open house was scheduled for 11. The yard signs, open house red and white, planted in the frost-hardened ground by the driveway, had been there since Thursday. I had driven past them twice and said nothing. I had waited. Patricia Holt pulled up behind me. She was wearing a navy wool coat and carrying a soft leather portfolio. She nodded at me. We walked up the front porch steps together, the cedar steps Dad had replaced in 2003, and I rang the bell with my own hand. Renee answered. She was dressed for the event. Blazer, pressed pants, hair done. Her friend Shelby was somewhere inside. I could hear movement from the kitchen. A man I didn't recognize, presumably the realtor, was arranging a small table of printed property sheets in the living room. The whole front room had been staged. Mom's things, the ceramics, the framed photographs, the lamp with the green glass shade she'd had since 1997, had been moved or removed. The space felt different. It felt like someone else's house. Renee looked at Patricia, then at me. Her expression cycled through several things quickly. She said, I thought Patricia and I were meeting at her office Monday. Patricia said pleasantly, there's been a development. May we come in? The realtor, his name was Tom Garrett, Century 21, card later provided, looked up from the property sheet table. He had the particular expression of a man who has just realized the Saturday he planned is not the Saturday he is going to have. We came in. Patricia set her portfolio on the kitchen table. Mom's kitchen table, oak, the one she'd had refinished in 2016, and opened it. She removed a single document. She placed it on the table face up and slid it toward the center so that everyone in the room could see it. She said, Renee, Your mother filed a transfer on death deed with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds in December of 2022. Upon your mother's death, the property at 44 Renfield Lane passed automatically to Callie Marsh. It does not go through probate. It is not subject to the standard estate distribution. She said it the way she said everything, without drama, without pause, at a measured pace that gave each sentence room to land. Renee said nothing for a moment. Tom Garrett said, "I'm sorry, are you saying the current listing is?" Patricia said, "The current listing is not valid. The seller does not own the property." Tom Garrett looked at the property sheets in his hand. He looked at Renee. He looked at me. He looked at Patricia. He said, "I need to make some calls." He went to the far end of the living room. I could see him on his phone through the doorway. Renee had not moved. She was standing at the kitchen island, the same kitchen island Mom and I had eaten breakfast at for 3 years, the same one with the small chip in the corner that I'd always meant to fill and never did, and she was looking at the document on the table. He picked it up. She read the first section. She set it down. He picked it up again. "December 2022, she said. "Yes," Patricia said. "Mom signed this in December 2022. "Your mother and her attorney," Patricia said. "Yes." Renee set the document down carefully like it might react to being handled. She looked at me for the first time since I'd come through the door. There was something in her face I hadn't expected. Not rage. Not calculation. Something more disorganized than either of those. She said, "You knew." I said, "Yes." "For how long?" 14 months. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She put her hand flat on the kitchen island. She pressed down on it like she needed it to be solid. She said, "And you didn't say anything. For 3 weeks you didn't." "You changed the locks," I said. "The morning after the funeral." She didn't say anything to that. I said, "You signed a listing agreement." Without asking me. Without calling Patricia. Kept my voice even. I wasn't angry. I was something older and quieter than anger. "You had a lot of decisions ready to go." Renee's friend Shelby had appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during this. I didn't know how long she'd been there. He was very still. Tom Garrett came back from the living room. He looked like a man who had received news. He said to Renee, "I'm going to need to pull the listing. I'll need to consult with my broker about the circumstances. I'm sorry." He gathered the property sheets. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. He left. There were 4 of us left in the kitchen. Patricia, Renee, Shelby, and me. Outside, through the kitchen window, I could see 2 couples pulling up to the curb in separate cars. They got out, looked at the house, looked at each other, looked at their phones, presumably the listing, and then after a moment got back into their cars and drove away. Renee watched this happen. She said to no one in particular, "I had an offer. I'd already had an offer." Patricia said, gently but without softening it, "Any offer made under the current listing is not valid." Renee looked at me. She said in a voice that I'd never heard from her before, something stripped down, the texture of it different, less certain. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" I looked around the kitchen. The table Mom had refinished. The window with the winter light coming through it. The back door that opened onto the porch, and beyond the porch the garden. The cedar raised beds. The dormant dahlias. I said, "I'm going to live in it." What happened in the weeks that followed was not dramatic. That's the truth. Renee retained an attorney. A woman named Joyce Alderman at Caldwell and Alderman on Patton Avenue. And Joyce spent about 2 weeks reviewing the transfer on death deed and the supporting estate documents before advising Renee that the filing was legally sound, properly witnessed, and not subject to meaningful challenge. Renee released Joyce Alderman, which I imagine was not an inexpensive exercise. Marcus called me once. A Tuesday evening. He said, "Callie, I want you to understand that Renee was in a difficult position." I let him say it. He said, "We had counted on certain things." I let him say that too. He said, "I don't think any of this is what your mother intended." I said, "Marcus, Patricia Holt has been in estate law for 22 years. My mother signed that deed with full capacity and full understanding. Whatever you believed was going to happen." I paused. "That was about what you assumed. Not about what Mom intended." He was quiet. I said, "I'll tell you what I told Renee. The $214,000 is real. It's there. It's available." I hope you find a way to be okay. I meant it. Not warmly, I'm not going to overstate what I felt, but genuinely. I wanted them to land somewhere stable. I just didn't have the ability to make that happen at the expense of the house. Marcus said, Renee would like to come and get some of Mom's things. I said, she can come whenever she wants. She has my number. That was a month ago. It is early April now, and the garden at 44 Renfield Lane is beginning again. I went to the nursery on Swannanoa River Road and bought tomato seedlings, early girls, which were Mom's preference, and lavender starts for the border because the lavender from last year didn't make it through the winter and I want the fence line back. I rebuilt the third raised bed last weekend. One of the cedar planks had rotted through. It took me 4 hours and it made my shoulders ache, and when I was done I sat on the back porch steps with a glass of water and I looked at what I'd built and I thought about my father measuring cedar in 1989, and my mother deciding the dahlias were her ridiculous indulgence, and the specific shape of a life built in one place over time. I don't know when Renee is going to call. She hasn't yet. I don't know what I'll say when she does. Here's what I know. I will not close the door. That's not what Mom would have wanted, and it's not what I want either. What happened between Renee and me is not the whole of what we are. It's not the whole of what we were when we were children in this house, when we shared a wall and a mother and a garden and a father who built raised beds in the backyard and called it the beginning of something. But I will tell her this when she calls. What you do in the first days after someone dies tells you something you can't unlearn. You can choose to build. You can choose to settle accounts. I will not be in the same room with the version of you that walked in the morning after the funeral with a realtor's card and a plan, and never once asked what the last 3 years had been. When you're ready to talk about what they were, I'm here. The door is unlocked. I just changed the lock. I'm putting the tomato seedlings in next weekend, when the overnight temps are stable enough. Mom always said, don't rush the tomatoes. They know what they need. You have to meet them where they are. I'm trying to do that. Type roots in the comments if you know what it means to stay when staying was the harder choice.